Welcome to On the Way, a podcast about life. But not just any life, it's about life with Jesus. Why do people follow Jesus, and how do they get started? And what difference does following Jesus make in their lives? Before Christians had a name, they were known as people of the way, people who followed Jesus' teachings. People have been on the way for nearly 2,000 years now. During the podcast, we explore the ways that people become followers of Jesus and why, and what difference following Jesus makes in their lives. On the Way is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard. I'm glad you're with us today. Well, we have with us this morning Jeremy Everett. Jeremy is the founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Before that, he was instrumental in starting the Texas Hunger Initiative, and I'll let you tell me more about that and if I'm wrong on that. But he also is the author of I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. And another interesting thing about Jeremy is that he was appointed by U.S. Congress to serve on the National Commission on Hunger, and I'd really like to hear how that came about. But we're glad that you're with us, Jeremy.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, we're asking those that come on the Way podcast a couple of questions, and one of the questions is, how did you become a follower of Christ? And the second question is, how does following Christ make a difference in your life? So let's start off with that first question.
Yeah. Well, I'm a third generation preacher's kid, and so I think for me it was growing up in the faith from day one. That was something that my parents really instilled in me. I remember them even talking about how much they prayed to determine what my name should be, and they landed on the prophet Jeremiah. I think my dad was voting for King James because my mom's maiden name was King, and they wanted to include King in the name, and so he was advocating for King James, but I think he got overruled. But growing up in the faith was a major part of my upbringing, and so I remember I said yes to Christ the first time when I was 5, and I think that just really probably was an articulation of I know this is the right path for me, but over the course of my life, it seems like it's been a constant re-articulation of that question of being able to say yes to my faith. And so it took a big turn for me when I was in college, because that's probably when my faith really became my own. When I was in college, we had moved around a lot growing up, and about every few years we would move, and we would joke that my dad only had 3 years worth of sermons, and so we moved to a lot of places. And so I remember when I got to college, I loved college because everybody that was a freshman was a new kid, and I knew how to be a new kid.
Yeah.
But much of my upbringing, I kind of straddled a bunch of different racial lines and socioeconomic lines, really not because I was aware of it. That was just how I did life. I played sports, and so oftentimes my friends who I played sports with might live in some of the rougher parts of town. Some of my basketball friends, I remember taking them home to the housing projects and some low-income housing situations, and oftentimes we play basketball and hang out there. But then the churches that we went to, oftentimes you might have a congressman or a mayor or city leaders who attended that church, and so I might spend the next part of the day with a friend at a country club, And so I was seeing these two worlds on a regular basis, and it was just normal for me until I got to college. And I think when I got to college, what was happening for me on a subconscious level, maybe seeing the inequities that we are faced with every day in life, began to be called to a conscious level. And so by the time I was a junior, I had been asking for years. I'd been asking my professors and my pastors and people that I was working with. I'd ask them, what to do about that unease with inequity in life. And most folks said you should feel grateful for what you grew up with, but it didn't seem like truth to me. And it was the summer after my junior year that I really was trying to get real with God. Through prayer and scripture study, I just was like, God, if you're real and Jesus really is your son, then how he lived on earth must be a roadmap for us in more ways than just his death and resurrection. Of course, our whole faith is built around his death and resurrection, and I think as Baptists we spend a lot of time on that, rightly so. It's why we have hope in dark times like right now. But at the same time, oftentimes we do that certainly I did. I didn't pay enough attention to who Jesus spent time with. What was he saying when he was here? Who did he want us to spend time with? What did he say about people that were living in poverty? What did he say about people that were outsiders? And it was through those questions and then encountering the story of St. Francis of Assisi, and as a good Baptist boy, I'd never heard of St. Francis,
right.
That really became transformational for me. And that's where I really began to recognize that God was calling me to people that were in poverty and living with hunger on a regular basis. And that became a defining moment for the rest of my life. And I've been, I think, hopefully deepening that commitment to Christ and trying to articulate Christ's love for all people, but particularly for people that are left out of our broken social systems. And that's really been the journey that I've been on for the last 25 years.
We're going to take a sponsor break, and we'll be right back.
Since 1952, South Texas Children's Home Ministries has focused on healing hearts and sharing hope. Their 9 ministries focus on helping hurting children and families, all regardless of an individual's ability to pay. To find out more, visit www.stchm.org.
So you've been doing this for 25 years.
Yeah, from the
wow.
Yeah,
I didn't realize
from the time I was in college and really felt the call. Yeah, it's coming up on 25 years here. So most of that was learning and spending time with people in poverty. I tell our students all the time that our students are very socially minded, socially engaged, and wanting to live out their faith on behalf of people that are maybe on the outskirts of society in many different ways. And I tell them there are 3 things that I think you really have to be committed to. One is proximity. You think about Jesus as an incarnational witness. I mean, he lived and dwelt among us, and that's how we understand who God is to us. And I think for us, it's important to have proximity to the people, particularly that are experiencing broken social systems, like the poor, who have struggled for oftentimes generations. It's important for us to have proximity to them because you can't solve a social problem from a distance. And I tell them it's important to understand what research suggests so that you make sure that your efforts to try to solve the problem you're addressing do more good than harm. And then you really have to be steeped in our faith tradition. So what is Jesus, or what does our larger faith tradition say about the issue that you're addressing? So most of the last 25 years, 20 of those years were living in low-income neighborhoods to try to gain that proximity. Like what's happening here? What are folks like both during the day from 9 to 5, but also after work hours, and building relationships so that I could gain more clarity and understanding of the plight of poverty in the U.S.
And that wasn't necessarily something that your peers were doing in terms of intentionally moving into low-income communities. Not
at the time. Most folks thought I had lost my mind. I think my family included. But I think fortunately for me, we were living through my first year of seminary. I had a group of people that would meet with me on a weekly basis, and we would pray and fast over lunch. And they were seminary students, and we wanted to do something about our faith. We wanted to live it out. And we determined that we were going to move into a low-income neighborhood together. And so 3 other guys and myself, we ended up renting a house in a low-income neighborhood and lived there together for several years. And through that period, I ended up meeting Jimmy Dorrell, who runs Mission Waco, and it was really wonderful on a whole lot of accounts. One, he introduced me to a larger context of Christians who were doing exactly what I felt prompted to do all over all over the country and all over the world. And at that point, I realized, one, there are wise elders that we can look to for guidance in real time, not just having to read historical documents about people like St. Francis and whatnot. But we can also join people in a community of folks that are trying to walk with people who are suffering. So those experiences were tremendous for me, and I think those first few years of living in the low income neighborhood of in North Waco was, I think, transformative for all of us. A story I like to tell, and I even put it in the book, that was pretty formational for me was one particular Saturday evening we oftentimes had prostitutes and drug dealers and all that literally worked out of our front yard. And we developed relationships with them, became friends with them. We would have them over for dinner, or we would, the prostitutes, oftentimes we bring them cold water out on those hot Texas summer nights and get to know them. One of the ladies that worked our corner, she had a daughter that was my age. And I was just thinking, here I was largely in seminary because that's what I knew. That's what my parents did. That's what my grandparents did. And I so being called to the ministry was, we joke that it's almost like a part of the family business. And but here this woman, this young woman, all she knew to survival was prostitution. And I was just like, it's just interesting to me how formational that is on both of our accounts. But through those relationships, one of the things that we would do oftentimes is we would have parties. And we would try to have parties and invite all of our friends from Baylor, from the seminary, and our professors. And then we would invite all the people from the neighborhood that we were getting to know. And over a couple of years, we might have a couple hundred people show up, and it was wild. So we would, Aaron Conaway, who's the pastor of 7th and James now, would man the grill. Mm-hmm. So he was always behind the grill, flipping burgers. And our other friends who were talented musicians would always have a guitar in their hand, and they'd be playing music with people from the neighborhood. And I remember our Halloween parties were always crazy because there would always be a dance party inside, and the kids from the neighborhood would be teaching the truant students and faculty how to dance and do the electric slide and things like that. It was just a blast. And it was a blast in part because you had two worlds of people that were really never supposed to meet each other.
And probably wouldn't otherwise. That's
right. We literally have built interstates and roads and bridges to try to keep these two groups of people apart. And so I felt like that our front yard of that little house in North Waco was sacred space. And it was sacred space because it was in that space we were able to see and recognize both our common humanity, and even more so, we were able to see and recognize that we were all created in the image of God. And though we had been separate for most of our lives for a whole host of reasons, I think that was a transformational experience for a lot of us that were involved with that. But one particular Saturday evening, we were planning to have a party the following week, and there was a police officer parked in our front yard, or right in front of our front yard. And so I thought, I'm going to invite the police officer to the party next week and see if we can do a block party and see if he can bring his family and party with people that maybe he's tried to arrest in the past. And I was thinking, man, this will be a wild experience, for everybody to get to know each other in a very different context. And so I was leaning over, kind of leaning with my head in his little window, and we were talking, and I was telling him about the party, and as I was talking to him, a guy rode by, and I guess assumed that I was a snitch, and he just started shaking his head at me like you don't do that in the neighborhood. You probably heard the saying, snitches get stitches, and I didn't want stitches. Yep. So he goes on, and I after I was done talking to the police officer, I didn't mention it to the police officer, but I walked back inside my house and I told my roommates, it's like, guys, let me tell you what just happened. And they were like, man, you got to go back out and try to find this guy and make peace with him. The last thing we need is a drive-by at our house. And I thought that was a horrible idea. So I was like, why don't I sketch you a drawing of what this guy looks like, and y'all go find it. But they won, and so I reluctantly went back outside, and time had transpired by the time I was able to get the courage, I think, to go back outside. The police officer was long gone, and nobody was there yet. Prostitutes hadn't shown up yet. It was just kind of a quiet front yard, and it was dark, and so I went and I sat down on our street corner right below the one little street light that we had. And I just sat there and waited just to see if this guy might happen to come back by. I had no idea what I was going to do if he did. But while I was waiting, a male prostitute named James walked out of the shadows and came over and greeted me and tried to start picking me up. And I had never met this guy before. I'd never seen him there before. I'd never been trying to be, no male prostitute ever tried to pick me up before. It was all a brand new experience for a largely suburban kid. And I was just, I was like, man, I'm not interested. And finally he gave up, and then he just started talking to me, telling me stories. And he was a great storyteller, very flamboyant storyteller. And after he was telling me these stories, then his stories that were initially hilarious started to slowly become more serious, and he started to tell me about his life. And he said that he and his brother grew up in the foster care system, and that they were sexually abused in every household that they lived in, except for one when he was 15. He said, when I was 15, he said, we lived in a home with a family that treated us like human beings. And that was his word. That was his language that he used. And he said, and I don't think I've known anybody that's treated me that way since. That was probably 30 or 40 years after when we were having the conversation. After that, he'd had that experience. And what broke my heart was that he and a number of the prostitutes lived a stone's throw away from one of our largest Baptist congregations in the community. And oftentimes we'll I've been at many churches where we provide money for, we hire security guards to keep people like James and those folks both out of the parking lots and out of our churches. And so we weren't really being the church to him. But after we talked for a while, and I asked him, I said, hey man, have you seen this guy that I'm looking for? I described him. And then it was as if it was on cue. I mean, he looks up and he's like, is that him coming right now? And I look up, and sure enough, it was. The guy was walking towards us. And I didn't really know what to do, so I just stood up and I walked out in the middle of the street, and I reached out my hand to shake his hand, and I introduced myself and quickly told him about the party that we were going to have the next week, hoping that might kind of calm some things down. And I think James knew how nervous I was, because he jumped in and he started telling stories again, and before you know it, things had kind of calmed between myself and this guy that I think thought I was a snitch. And now, we're bonding because we're laughing at these stories that James is telling us, and then several of the prostitutes ended up kind of walking up, and a homeless guy and his cousin who lived next door to us started walking up, and we're all just kind of huddled, in the middle of our front yard, late on a Saturday night, and it's just a completely wild experience. James turns to me and he says, "Hey, why don't you read us some scripture?" And I was like, "Are you serious?" And he's like, "Yeah." He said, "Read some scripture." And I was like, "Man," I said, "it's late. Why don't you just come to church with me tomorrow?" And he's like, "No, read us some scripture right now." And so I was like, "All right." So I went inside and I got my Bible and I came back out and I read him a passage out of Matthew when Jesus is doing the Sermon on the Mount. He says to his disciples, "Look, don't worry about your body, what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. Just worry about kingdom things. I'll take care of the rest." And I read that, and the irony is that he and the community probably modeled that back to me more than anybody that I'd ever known, in a very deep way. And after I read the scripture, then he said, "Well, let's pray." And so he got us all in the front yard, and we're all holding hands, and he asked me to pray. So I prayed for a little bit, and then after I'm done, then he starts praying. I mean, he's praying for all those friends who are prostitutes by name, praying earnestly that that he would see them tomorrow morning, because he knew it wasn't uncommon for them to get beat up real badly by John, and he loved them. They were his friends, and he loved them, and he wanted to see them that next morning.
Yeah, that was his community.
That's right.
Yeah.
And for me, it felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. I don't know if I should laugh or cry or what, but it was experiences like that, when you have proximity, that leave an indelible mark on your life, and you're never the same after that. And so I'm grateful that James and the community of that of North Waco invested in us in ways like we were hoping to invest in them as well. But
yeah.
that was really sacred space. That was a transformational experience for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable, and I can understand why your parents and others would have thought this is crazy. We're going to take a 60-second sponsor break, and we'll be right back. High Ground Advisors has a 90-year history of providing investment management and planned giving solutions to churches, faith-based organizations, and charitably minded individuals dedicated to transforming lives. High Ground is trusted by over 450 nonprofit clients, and we're one of them. High Ground has partnered with Baptist Standard for over 70 years by offering a comprehensive charitable giving and investment solutions model, which includes asset management, planned giving education and development, account support services, real estate and minerals management, and expert legal consultation. High Ground and the Baptist Standard share similar values, such as serving those who are called and dedicated to transforming lives and being a trusted caretaker of legacies. They also value good stewardship, helping those who desire to be good stewards of their financial resources to find creative giving solutions to fulfill that calling. They know what they do to protect, strengthen, and grow our mission is ultimately in service to the gospel. To learn more about how High Ground Advisors can partner with you or your organization, visit their website at highgroundadvisors.org. So, moving on from that those early years, I say early years, it's when you were in college and you're having these experiences in your front yard, on the street corner in front of your house, and then where did you go from there?
Well, shortly after my wife and I got married, Amy was finishing up her truant degree and a social work degree. We ended up moving to San Antonio and to work with a handful of organizations, BCFS, Trinity Baptist, and the local Baptist Association, BGCT, CBF. I think we're all involved with it. The funny thing was, before we moved down there, my wife and I were talking. She's also a third-generation Baptist preacher's kid, and when we were thinking, we're interested in issues of social justice and simplicity, and I just don't think that I think our time being Baptist has probably come to an end. And so we were coming to grips with that, and assumed that we would probably become a part of another faith tradition, and at the same time I was looking for jobs and called a friend of mine who was a pastor in San Antonio, and he said, Jeremy, I think we need to be doing more Christian social action in our community. We need to be living and sharing the gospel with the fruit of how we live and how we bring about justice in our community. And he said, why don't you come on down here and we'll talk about it. And within a few months, I was working for 5 Baptist organizations, and my wife and I just thought that was hilarious. Here we thought our time with Baptist had come to an end, and then before you know it, we're working with all these different Baptist groups, and it's which is in many ways I think it was neat. I think congregations were beginning to realize that this may be something that we needed to do and that we hadn't been doing enough of. And so I think they were articulating that both in word and in deed during that time period, and still have been since. And so we ended up moving to San Antonio for me to do community ministry work on the west side of San Antonio. And the west side was a very historically low-income neighborhood, had about 150,000 residents. The median income was about $19,000 per household. and each household had an average of 3 generations sharing a home. So not a lot of money to
No.
go around for a lot of people. Our best high school had a 50% dropout rate.
Wow.
And so we knew that community was not only in poverty today, but they were going to be in poverty for a long time to come. So that was where we felt called to, and we had our first son, our oldest son Lucas, 2 weeks after we moved there, and bought a little house in the neighborhood, and a few years later welcomed our second son Samuel, and we were there for about 5 years working in that community.
What do you think was causing churches to, I'm going to use the phrase, open their eyes to the need to begin to engage in Christian social action?
I think that we didn't have the resources to do things independently anymore. And when you don't have the resources to do things independently, but you still want to do things, you start to partner. And when you start to partner with people that may not come from the exact same tradition that you work with or are from, it begins to expand your worldview. So I think some of that was happening. Baptist churches were beginning to partner with other churches in the community. They were beginning to partner with other institutions in the community. So I think a lot of that was causing people maybe to evolve in their understanding of our call to our brothers and sisters who live in poverty. And then I think also what was happening is that people were looking around in their congregations and they didn't see young adults anymore. And certainly they're still doing that.
Yeah.
And though we as a generation were not as socially conscious maybe as these millennials have been or are, but I think there was a growing awareness that we were that those are the kinds of issues that we were interested in. So I think for many Baptist leaders, they were thinking, okay, what can we do to engage young adults? I think a third thing is I also think they felt like when we work together for the common good, if we work together to solve hunger, for example, we've still got a lot of capacity as Baptists, and we can still really make a big difference if we focus on something that's positive that can unite all of us together. So I think a handful of those things were probably all happening, at least on a subconscious level, and so that ended up providing space for us to do community ministry work in San Antonio. And one of the things the neighborhood kept telling us was like, we're a neighborhood of 150,000 residents, and we're in an age of Starbucks on every corner and other parts of the community, but we don't even have one coffee shop in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so we decided a creative package would be to create a coffee shop where we could employ people from the neighborhood and provide educational opportunities to the kids, and it really ended up becoming the de facto community center during that period. And it was we called it Guadalupe Street Coffee because it was sitting right there in the heart of the West Side. It was a beautiful experience.
At some point in there, you ended up being appointed by U.S. Congress to serve on the National Commission on Hunger. How did that happen, and what did that involve?
A handful of steps. One, the first step was coming back to Baylor to create the Texas Hunger Initiative, and that was a partnership with the Christian Life Commission at BDCT. So by the point I was working in San Antonio, I had done some volunteer work in Birmingham with low-income families and in DC and Washington D.C. and then worked for Mission Waco and lived in low-income Waco for a while, and then did the same thing in San Antonio. I was like, the people are experiencing hunger and poverty in the U.S. largely for the same subset of reasons, but all of our responses are local responses. And I said, I feel like we're trying to stop internal bleeding with a topical cream. And it's like, it doesn't matter how much cream you put on the body, you're not going to stop internal bleeding. Like, we've got to figure out how to address this systemic problem in a systemic
the larger
capacity.
system.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. And so when Susie called me to talk about this Texas Hunger Initiative project in partnership with Baylor, that is what set me up to be able to kind of test out, can you work on a local, state, and federal level at the same time to address a poverty-related issue? And hunger historically has been a uniting issue. It's been something that you could get Republicans and Democrats to work on together. We are able to get Catholics and Baptists to work on it together, and Muslim and Jewish faith communities to work on it together. We even joke that we can even get the Baylor Bears and the folks down, the Aggies down in College Station, to work together on this issue. So it must be truly a bipartisan issue if we can do that. But we, yeah, that's right. So 5 years into that project, Congress, at this point we've been rocking and rolling for a while, and a lot of good things were happening in Texas, and Congress decided to create the National Commission on Hunger. They wanted to find out, the state of the union. Why were so many Americans experiencing food insecurity? Over 40 million Americans experiencing food insecurity in the U.S. and why were they experiencing it? And were the federal programs that we had developed, were they working? Were there other interventions that were working? Or if they weren't working, why weren't they working? And so I was fortunate enough to be appointed. There were 10 of us. And then we spent the next 2 years really traveling around the country, listening to people who were experiencing food insecurity. We would be in their homes or in community centers, sitting with them and hearing their stories, meeting with organizations that were addressing the issue, and then hearing from researchers. We literally read all of the current research that was available to us at that time to really see what research was suggesting. And then we would travel around, and when we would travel, we would have public hearings. And so we would invite people to provide testimony, and then we would just open it up to the general public. And those were incredible. One of them was in El Paso, and we'd met with a group of community folks the day before. One story that left an indelible mark, part of that was we met with a group of elders who had met each other in a citizenship class that they were taking. They lived in the U.S. almost their entire lives. They'd raised their children here, and their one wish was to die a U.S. citizen.
Oh, wow.
And so even though they were incredibly poor, they didn't have retirement, they weren't getting Social Security because of their documentation, and they were very, by this point, they were really elderly, and many of them had been injured on the job and didn't get workers' comp or anything. And they'd been mechanics and farmers and custodians in hotels and whatnot, and they were trying to scrape together enough money to be able to take the citizenship test. As we were sitting with them, we visited with them for about an hour and a half, and I asked them pointedly, I said, "Do you have any food in the house?" And they all kind of looked away so they wouldn't make eye contact. And one elderly woman looked at me and she said, "We don't have food every day, but when we do, I'll make us, my husband and I, a plate of beans and a couple of tortillas." She said, "We're older now, so we don't need as much." And another man looked at me right in the eyes and he said, "Remember us when you come into your kingdom." And I was just like, wow, here we were. As many times as we'll sing that Tizay chant at church, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And as many times as I've read those words or I've sung that song, I honestly had not imagined myself living in the kingdom now.
Yeah.
But he was right. He and the rest of the group were going to go back to homes where they were isolated, and they had very little food. And I was going to go back to a hotel and have a nice meal, and then return to D.C. to the halls of power to deliver our report. And it just stuck me. And the next day we were having this big hearing in the same room, but this time there were hundreds of people gathered, and an elderly man came up, and he had been a professor at Texas A&M, and his job was to work with the colonias on the Texas-Mexico border. And he was telling us some stories of what was happening in the colonias. And as you probably know, the colonias oftentimes don't have running water. They may not have certainly paved roads. Some of them are beginning to get electricity. But he said that his public health workers would go door to door to find out about the health and well-being of the community. And he asked one of his public health workers to go do a survey in a particular colonia, and she was visiting with the woman, and she asked the woman a similar question, the one I'd asked the day before. She asked if she had any food in the house, and the woman walked her over to her little area that kind of served as a kitchen with a small refrigerator, and she opened up the refrigerator door, and there was just a little bag of chicken bones in the fridge. And the public health worker said, well, why in the world do you just have a bag of chicken bones in your fridge? And she said, this way, when my kids get home from school, they'll at least see that something's there.
Oh, wow.
And here we were sitting, trying to preside over this, and just thinking, man, surely we can do better than this. You know, as people of faith, we can't get around it. Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. The criteria for judgment in Matthew 25 is whether or not we acted with love and cared for the needy. And oftentimes we treat it like it's just extra credit, but the reality is it's in Matthew 25, it is how Jesus begins to separate us as sheep and goats. And so I think that's something that those experiences certainly have left a mark on my life, and I hope that that the Spirit of God will continue to work in my life, to use those experiences to help me in the community around us work towards economic justice for everybody.
Where are you seeing hope, some good progress in the direction we need to go in Christian social action?
What's great is these young adults they get it. And when I have conversations with our students and I hear about, I listen to how smart they are and the things that they want to tackle in life, I'm just like, I'm getting to be a part of some cool things with our Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, and we're doing some innovative projects. But these young adults are going to blow the doors off when they're our age. But I'm also excited because we're starting to see, like right now, we've just launched a giant national response to this COVID-19 crisis, and it's requiring all hands on deck. It's requiring school districts and congregations and the business sector and the government and everybody to work in step with each other. I mean, I have been on the phone more this week than I think I have my entire life, trying to figure out how we're going to get boxes of food to kids that otherwise wouldn't have access to food because school's out. They've got transportation issues because many people live so far away from schools that it's prohibitive for them to even drive up and pick up a curbside meal. A woman drove up with a carload full of kids to pick up meals, and then she drove up 10 minutes later with a different carload full of kids and parents to pick up meals.
Oh,
and then she did it again 5 minutes later, and finally he stopped her. He said, "Ma'am, what's going on?" And she said, well, my neighbors didn't have transportation, and he talked to her more, and she didn't really even know these families, but she just knew that they had kids that needed meals, and she knew where the site location was, and so she just became the taxi driver for her neighborhood, and so seeing people doing things like that's I think that's pretty special.
Yeah.
And we're seeing Democrats and Republicans working on this together. So those are the kinds of things that I get really encouraged by. I think it's kind of like when I lived in the old North Waco neighborhood, and when we brought those very different groups of people together. I love it. I get really energized, particularly in an age when we are all a bunch of ideologues and we argue more than we agree. I love seeing people work together across sectoral lines.
Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us on the On the Way podcast. And I'm grateful that you're on the way with Christ and that you're leading others to be on the way with Christ too.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on here with you, and thanks for what you're doing to help point people in the direction of deepening their faith experience.
Just because a person follows Jesus doesn't mean that person is perfect. Following Jesus is a lifetime of growing more like Him. Likewise, while there are followers who are more mature than others, who have spent more time growing close to Jesus than other followers, there are no followers of Jesus who are better than others. If you aren't on the way with Jesus, we invite you to check out the Follow Jesus page on the Baptist Standard website at baptiststandard.com/Follow Jesus to learn more about becoming a follower of Him. If you are on the way with Jesus, we hope that this podcast has encouraged you to grow more like Him. The On the Way podcast is produced by the Baptist Standard. a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. To make a donation, visit baptiststandard.com/donate. To receive the Baptist Standard weekly newsletter, visit baptiststandard.com and click on the subscribe button. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard, and I'm glad you've been with us today.